When I met my husband, Svi, we came together and we realized very early, our approaches to Judaism were quite vast and different. So I grew up Reform in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is like the mothership of Reform, classical church-like Judaism. And Svi grew up Modern Orthodox in Canada. And so I came to Judaism with a Reform philosophy that Judaism is done by choice through knowledge, meaning you learn about Judaism and then you decide what you want to practice based on what you know about it and what sort of meaning it might offer you. And Svi grew up in a very different manner. He was stringently observant when we met, and I remember early on I would say to him, I would see him observe Shabbat in a traditional way, and I said, why do you do this? Why do you keep Shabbat in this way, all of these different pieces, and the preparation? And his answer was, I just do. This is my life. And I couldn't grasp that. I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean you just do this? You don't think about why you're doing it, what you want to choose to do? And he said, no, this is my life. This just is how I practice Shabbat. And so this question was particularly present for me in this week's parasha, Chukat. So the parasha opens with a chukah, or a ritual law, the para aduma, or a red heifer. Now, it should be mentioned, before I explain what that is, that there are thought to be two different types of mitzvot, or commandments, in the Torah. Rambam taught that a mishpat is a law that we could figure out on our own. It often has to do with society building or how we treat one another. And then he described a chukah as a law that we could not intuit on our own. It's a command that requires a revelation from God. So an example of a chukah is para aduma, or this ritual around the red heifer. So it's a seemingly obscure ritual where an unblemished, red, never childbearing cow is sacrificed and burned by the priests as a sacrifice to God. And then the ashes are taken with a few other substances and put in a vessel containing pure spring water. And this is a part of the ritual purification for when a person is tameh, or impure, particularly after coming into contact with the dead. So I don't know many of us who would be able to intuit this sort of ritual, complete with all of the steps toward purification. It's a bit bizarre, specific, and there's a lot of questions around it. So there's a midrash in Bamidbar Rabbah that I found to be particularly resonant to how it reflects to the way many liberal Jews view our tradition. So in the midrash, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who famously was smuggled out of Jerusalem preceding the fall of the Second Temple in a coffin and ended up in Yavne with a small crew of scholars, and he's credited with maintaining and reinventing Judaism outside of a temple-based religion, but more to one we practice today, with study and law and in synagogues. So it's notable that the Midrash has Yochanan ben Zakkai at its center, and he's approached by an idolater. And the idolater says to him, what is this ritual with the red heifer? What is this? Isn't this sorcery? It doesn't make sense, he seems to imply. Haven't we all had moments when people say to us, what is this? What is this ritual you're doing? Why are you doing this? It doesn't make sense to an outside eye. So the Midrash captures this idea from the idolater. This looks silly. And Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, haven't you ever had a spirit that you wanted to make go away? You have a similar ritual. So we have also rituals that are for getting rid of spirits. And the idolater seemingly, I guess, took the answer. You don't hear his response and goes away. But then Yochanan ben Zakkai's students come up to him and say, okay, what's the real answer? That wasn't good enough. Tell us what the real deal is. And his answer, because God said so in the Torah, and you're not to disobey the Torah. Zot chukat haTorah. This is the law of Torah, as the parsha begins to introduce the red heifer. Or in other words, we do this ritual because it's what we do. So I love this midrash, not necessarily for the answer at the end, but for the admittance of an insecurity by his students around these laws that seemingly don't make sense. Yet these students are tasked with carrying on the Jewish project when it was probably much easier to opt out. And their questions remind me of when I used to ask Tzvi, but really, give me a reason. In a similarly resonant situation that we've probably all been in today, the Midrash confronts us with maybe the rational brain saying, why are we following this practice? Now, for some of you, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's answer might be enough. We do these rituals and halacha because God said so. But for many, it's not enough. Many of us want clear answers for how we live, particularly when the activity is ritual-based and on the surface seems out of the norm. However, alongside that questioning voice is the voice of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Much of how we practice Judaism is just what we do. So as Tzvi and I started dating a number of years ago, this concept started to make sense to me. As I dabbled more in an observant Shabbat practice, I would tell everyone, including myself, why I chose to do everything that I did. It felt good to unplug. It was nice to be with community on Shabbat. I felt myself connecting to something greater than myself. However, after a few years of this Shabbat practice became my norm, and it just was. And when I've been confronted with challenges, like recently we had to walk 2.5 hours to a family bat mitzvah, I just did it. And my family kept asking, why are you doing this? And I said, it's what I do. This is my life. And when I began to think about why, I didn't even want to entertain that idea. I didn't want to go there. It messed with my Shabbat and how I live Jewishly. And that's what Yochanan ben Zakkai taught. It's how it is. So for many of you here tonight, you are here in services because it's what we do. It's what Jews do on Shabbat. However, after reading this midrash, I now see why the students' questions are so important to this teaching. For us to live fully Jewish and spiritually connected lives, I believe we need a little of both. Part of us that does Jewish in a certain way because it's just what we do, and part of us that wrestles and tries to really figure out what our intention is behind each practice. So you're all already here, singing along with us with a set liturgy. That is the way Jews bring in Shabbat. But why did you come here tonight or tune in to the live stream? Why do you keep engaging with Judaism? Why are you wrestling with these traditions that are centuries old? As these answers bubble up, I believe they hold the key to our deeper relationship with God, ourselves, and this tradition. Yochanan ben Zakkai knew he couldn't come up with a rational answer for every part of Judaism. However, the Midrash preserves the age-old question of why. So as Jews who are engaging in this tradition centuries old, the Kavannah, or intention we bring to our Jewish practice, is what makes these practices feel alive. So by welcoming in the Shabbat bride in a few moments, may we allow the liturgy, the song, the being in this space all together, may we allow all of that to elevate us to a higher connection with this tradition we're so lucky to call ours. Shabbat Shalom.